Welcome to the latest episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One with me, Rod Grant.
And me, Cameron Wyllie.
And Cameron, I think this particular episode we're going to be looking at bullying, but before we get into that, perhaps we'll have a look at some emails we've received.
Definitely. And first of all, a big shout out to Melanie, who we know has passed on the details of this podcast to her many, many, many friends. And we hope those many, many, many friends are A, listening and B, enjoying it. And just a reminder that it's very, very useful to us if you enjoy this podcast to send on the link to other people, particularly those in teaching, but not necessarily.
Indeed, and also to Stuart in California. We've been analysing the results from America are very good. We've several hundred listeners in America, but 45 from California. So Stuart, thank you for your kind words in your email. But also clearly spreading the word.
And thank you also to President Trump, who we know is listening to our podcast avidly and hopefully going to do something about American education with the results of that. But also, more seriously, to Tom, who has sent us a long email in which he discusses homeschooling and suggests that we should do an episode on homeschooling, and we do intend to do that.
Indeed, but we'll save that for later. Next week is next episode. We're discussing
next episode. We think we'll be on additional support needs.
Yep. And we'll have a guest.
And we'll have a guest. So that's something to look forward to. And do you want to talk about the one beyond that, Rod?
Well, actually, yes. This was a suggestion from a young man, 18, who said, listen to your podcast, thoroughly enjoyed it. But what I'd really like to hear, and my age group might like to hear, are just anecdotes, funny stories from your own school experience. So I thought maybe we could do an episode where we simply talk about those funny things that have happened in school, both to ourselves as teachers, but perhaps also to us as pupils.
And also, of course, we would very much welcome contributions from all and sundry about the funniest thing that happened to you in the school via our email address, which is rodandcameron@gmail.com, rodandcameron@gmail.com. So please send us feedback on this episode, but also send us the funniest things that happened to you in school, either as a pupil or as a teacher.
And we look forward to receiving a multitude of funny stories that we can relate in a few months' time.
So that, of course, very neatly segues into the very funny topic of bullying. And I wanted to start off, Rod, by asking you if you were ever bullied when you were at school.
Well, no, I don't actually think I was. I mean, you would know, wouldn't you, if you've been bullied? I think certainly at primary school, I came from quite a different kind of family, if you like, because I was the youngest of four. So my brother is 12 years older, his sisters were 16 and 18 years older. And of course they had grown up in the kind of swinging 60s. They were all, hippies and dressed fabulously and listened to amazing music and had hippie friends. And so I grew up in a kind of a house that was quite, I think, culturally advanced, so we say, which made me a little bit different from the other kids in my class. My mother was English as well, so I was relatively well spoken for the area in which I was brought up. Not saying that English are better spoken, but you know what I mean.
Well, he did say that, really, didn't he, everybody?
Yeah, you know what I mean. But there was a softer element to my voice, perhaps less ayrshire than my peer group. And of course, very much grew up in a house where I was the youngest by a mile, and basically surrounded by adults who were all doing very interesting things. Brother had a band that practiced upstairs, and they were really good. So that kind of made me, I don't know, slightly different, I think, because I was used to adult company. So I wasn't bullied, but I did feel different and perhaps a bit isolated at times.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds pretty mild-mannered to me. I mean, I think there was no doubt whatsoever that I was to some extent bullied when I was at school. I was small, blonde, my voice didn't break till I was about 15. And obviously, though I perhaps didn't completely appreciate that at that point, I was gay. I can remember one particular instance that took place on the rugby field. You'd be surprised, Rod. We'll be very surprised here to learn that rugby was not exactly my forte. I used to run away from the ball actively, much to the distress of my open inverted commas rugby coaches. And my friend Colin and I used to stand at the back of the rugby pitch and talk about what we would like to do if we owned a large house buried beneath the rugby pitch and what, accoutrements and various furnishings we would have in there. This eccentricity of character didn't necessarily appeal to the masses. And I remember, but I did have a kind of smart, cheeky mouth. And I remember once being on the rugby field and saying something to a dopey big boy, and the dopey big boy, he pushed me over. However, I had a very good friend whose loss I still regret, who passed away some time ago, called Dougie. And what I remember is that Dougie came over, picked up the boy who had pushed me onto the ground and threw him over my head. And I can remember lying on the ground thinking, what's going to happen next? And seeing this boy sailing over my head. So I think there's no doubt that I was a pretty obvious victim in a boys' school which ran high to people who were good at sport. I don't think I ever went home and said I thought I was being bullied. I think I just thought it kind of slightly came with the territory, which is an aspect of this that we will get onto. So the second question, Rod, is have you ever been a bully? Carlton spoke here. You can't see him, ladies and gentlemen. Honestly, sweating. He's turned red. He's shaking his fist at me now.
No, categorically no. I really didn't. I don't think I was ever in the position where I was going to ever feel that I needed to turn on a victim. I don't know. I just, honestly not.
You see, I think this is interesting because, I can't speak for you, obviously, but I bet there are a very few people out there who might think that at one point or another I had bullied them when I was a senior member of staff in a school. And I'm not talking about kids, because I don't think, well, I'd very much regret it if there was a single one of my 8,000 pupils who thought I had bullied them. I'm talking about teachers. I'm talking about specifically teachers who weren't very good. And I think that there's a very fine line, and we see this all the time in society, where people allege they have been bullied by management, when in fact, management might well respond by saying, I'm just trying to get you to do your job properly. And I think that's a very, very fine line. So I think there are probably people out there who I or my colleagues have chastised for not doing their job very well, who might describe themselves as feeling bullied. I think that's the bottom line.
Well, so on that, I remember a visiting specialist discussing how to support teachers who were not up to scratch. And we all know that there are plenty of teachers that colleagues will be moaning about because they're not doing their job, they're not doing very well. Parents are on the phone, there's a lot going on.
When Rod says plenty, everybody out there who's listening to us, 90% of you teachers, he doesn't mean plenty. He means a few. It's to do with his particular approach to language, where he exaggerates slightly. He didn't mean plenty.
No, I didn't mean plenty. I think the phrase that springs to mind in those situations is not actually bullying to me. It's what I would call relentless support.
Yes. So you weren't a bully, you were a relentless supporter.
Exactly.
Yes, me too.
Yeah,
me too.
Yeah, you dog with a bone. You're not going to let go.
But it does bring us on to the interesting issue of what bullying is.
And is not.
And is not. Yeah, but I think let's now focus on what people regard or people talk about as bullying between different school pupils, between two school pupils.
Yeah.
So what is it that how do we define bullying? How do you decide that somebody is being bullied is really the question.
Yeah, for me, it's relentless. It's systematic. In other words, it's not a one-off incident where two boys fall out with each other on the football pitch and the bigger boy kicks the other boy in the shin and everybody feels sorry for the younger, smaller boy.
Though that does have to be dealt with.
That has to be dealt with, but it's not what I would perceive as bullying.
I agree.
So bullying for me has to be a regular occurrence from a person or a group of persons against an other.
Yes, I would agree with that, and it can take many, many forms. But the issue very often is an issue to do with perception. So, and this brings us back to questions like, well, of course, in the past there were different times, people were treated in kind of different ways, and actually coming contemporaneously up to date.
Easy for you, sir.
It brings us to Mr. Farage, interestingly, curiously. Welcome, Nigel. Welcome to Two Heads Are Better Than One. It's really good that he's come here. Now, Nigel, you have allegedly bullied people in the past verbally by saying racist and anti-Semitic things to them. Now, I think this is a really interesting case because, I don't know how far you agree with this, Rod. It does sound to me, despite the fact that Mr. Farage has gone through various different explanations of this, one of his explanations was that it was just banter. How do you respond to the idea that saying racist or anti-Semitic things in the 70s, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, was banter?
Yeah, well, it's context, doesn't it? I'm a great believer in context. I don't believe in a whole nonsense of taking down statues of historical figures that didn't do things that we want them to do now, because you are not living in those times. Now, in the 70s, you look back and you had Love Thy Neighbour, you had the black and white minstrel show.
Well, this is one of Mr. Farage's arguments.
You know, I have some sympathy with that.
Yeah, I agree with too.
Because certainly in the 70s when I was at school, you would get people who are doing, things that you would be absolutely abhorrent now, would be expelled for now.
Yeah.
Like, I remember kids having watched probably Monty Python or whatever, doing goose steps up and down the playground and, raising their finger to below their nose to imitate Hitler's moustache. Like, it's unimaginable that would happen now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, so in 1981, which would be my second year of teaching at Stuart's Melville College, it was the first time I actually really got angry with a pupil. And in the corridor, a boy whose name I can still remember, whose face I can still see, used a racial epithet, an unsuitable racial epithet. Well, there's no suitable racial, but a racial epithet about another boy in the hurly-burly of changing. And I'm not sure he was even being very, very unpleasant, but it was really interesting because it was a kind of tipping point, because I knew that it was my duty to prevent this from happening in a way which I'm sure that even 10 years previously, the emphasis would have been completely different. So, I mean, I think that I am in no doubt that if Mr. Farage said the things that he is alleged to have said, he meant them unpleasantly.
Yeah.
But whether or not that's something we could realistically hold against him as we approach the general election of 2029, I'm very uncomfortable with that, because I suspect strongly that when the political world out there began to read about this all being said about Nigel Farage, quite a lot of people thought, oh God, I hope they don't find out what I said when I was at school to other people, because the kind of person who wants to become a politician, well, I think quite a lot of these people might have been inclined to do a bit of bullying of a verbal nature or otherwise when they were at school.
Yeah, I mean, we would have started the discussion with, did we ever bully? And actually, I don't think I did, but you heard and probably used phrases as a 16, 17-year-old that you would never, back in the 70s or 80s, that you would never consider using now.
That's definitely
I mean, I can't even, this is, shocking to the core, but my uncle, who lived in London, had a dog that was a black spaniel, whose name...
I'm not going to even let you think about saying it.
I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it.
That's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. And he ended up actually being a Tory councillor. So, you're right, I think.
And these days, the dog's voting reform.
And has long since dead. Yeah, so... I think context, I think social context, I think that it's a bit like, I get really frustrated when people say, oh, it's a uncivilized country and, there's civil war and thousands dead and what they're doing arguing over land. But it's only a few hundred years ago that we were doing the same in Scotland. We're all at different points in our history. And we have to allow, people to grow, nations to grow at their pace, not defined by what we find acceptable, but at the stage of the journey that they are on in their development.
Yeah, I mean, the mention of cultural things is quite interesting because I do think that bullying has a kind of cultural aspect as well. Not that long ago, we had a pupil who was American, a Jewish American boy, who the community came to like very much. Even though he was really, really unusual. I mean, he when he was kind of 12, he had facial hair and he spoke extremely slowly. And he was regarded initially by the other boys I think he was in, I don't know which year group that was, I'm just trying to remember, but it was maybe like second year he came into it. His mother was a visiting professor at university. And he was regarded as being quaint, at least, by a lot of the kids. And I saw his mother after about 6 months, and she said, well, he's really enjoying it here, but he hasn't really made many friends. I'll keep wishing he'd bring somebody home with him or go to somebody's house kind of thing. That's really not happening. Another 6 months passed. She came and said, I'm kind of unhappy about some things that are going on to him because, he started playing football with the other boys, clearly a good sign. And they say things like, oh, come on, are you crippled to him? And I said, that means they like him. This is Scotland where your best friend is the one that you say, wee poof to, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a kind of has this antithetical thing going on. And in fact, he I think had a very happy time at the school overall. But that for me was proof, not so that he was being bullied, but that he was being liked.
Yeah.
I think there are circumstances. Have you ever in a circumstance where somebody's accused somebody of bullying and it's not been true, where you've come out and said, actually, that's not bullying?
Many times, because I think,
where they're not even culpable, though.
yeah, I have had that. I think, but also parents' perception of what bullying is very different actually to what my perception might be.
Well, I mean,
we're huge generalizations here, but there are a number of parents over the years who've been in touch with me to say that their son or their child, their daughter is being bullied, and you find out that there was an argument in the teaching room and one child pushed another, and again, that's an unhappy incident, but that's so easily mediated. Yeah, it certainly is not bullying.
No, I mean, bullying, it becomes it eventually comes down to perception. And I do feel quite strongly that if somebody feels they are being bullied, then the incident should always be investigated as a bullying incident.
Yes, and it's interesting, Cameron, that children's definition of bullying now, I think, comes from what parents see as bullying in that situation. And so you can get kids that have been pushed in the change room saying, he's bullying me. And I turn this woman, why has he done this before? No. And do you normally get on it? Yes. Yeah. Well, you're not being bullied.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about situations in which somebody accuses somebody. I can think of 2 or 3 situations, one of which was a glorious and awful thing where a small boy, his parent, sent in a letter saying that their child was being bullied and having money taken off him in school on a regular basis by the same people. So they had frightened him into believing that on, say, a Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, he should come to the toilets, and they, at that point, relieved him of his cash. So pretty clear cut. Awful, really. Mm. And we asked the small boy to describe the people involved, and he described a boy who was 3 years older than him to a T. I mean, he just described this boy who's trouble, So my wonderful deputy and I set about interviewing this boy who we'd interviewed many times because he was a rogue. When he said that I would do a thing like that, I'd never done that, I don't even know who this is. And we showed him pictures of the kid. Absolute denial. And the little boy had said there were 2 or 3 of them. So he said, so who would you have been with on a Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock? He said, a Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, I'm not in school. He said, I come to school at, the last possible minute. I hate school, he said. I thought, that's true, actually. 8 o'clock is quite early for him to be here, meeting up in the toilets with his cronies to get a fiver off this kid. Anyway, we investigated a little bit further, and having listened to this, we then got the little boy back in, and it was a completely made-up story. He just knew that this older kid was in trouble. So he fixed the fact that he was spending money right, left and centre, actually mainly on sweeties, and telling his mother that he was losing this money because he was being taken off him. And the mother, of course, had believed it. I mean, one of the points about this business, the relationship between a parent and bullying, comes back to one of my big beliefs, which is that parents' love is the most wonderful thing possible, but it's a very good reason for not paying all that much attention to what parents say about their child in professional circumstances. The "I know my child better than anyone" argument doesn't really work very well for me, because yes, they do, and that's a very good reason for assuming they can't be objective.
Yeah, I agree with that. As a parent myself, you are probably slightly less objective, although the joint role of head and parent is it's a very tricky bit. Anyway, that's for another day.
And assuming that we have defined somebody as being a bully, how do we deal with the bully and with the victim?
Well, this is going to sound very kind of left-wing and not at all Rod Grantish, but I do believe, but I do believe in bringing people together, and mediating in some way, on the first occasion. So the first occasion when I recognised that actually this is something that hasn't been spotted by staff, but it has been going on, the boys admitted to, saying unkind things to another child. Sometimes in a year or two below, which is even worse, then we have to give them the opportunity to see the error of their ways.
Yes.
I believe in that. The approach when the mediation doesn't work is entirely different. I do the kind of the Basil Fawlty, jumping up and down, shouting thing, which of course teachers don't do anymore, not that shout. But I shouted regularly at miscreants.
And that was just staff.
That was staff, yeah, indeed. And if that didn't work, as far as I was concerned, it was 3 strikes and you're out. Suspend, expel.
Yeah, I think that I'm not necessarily, interestingly, I'm not sure that's the order that I would do things in. I mean, I was always quite regarded as being quite soft, but I wasn't soft about bullying. Part of the reason for that is that, as you will know, a lot of the times, the victim of actual bullying is very afraid to talk about it. And they're very afraid to talk about it because it will get worse, they perceive.
Yeah.
And that brings in the very interesting area of confidentiality. And it brings in the very interesting area of the role of older kids. So like, the prefect in schools that have prefect systems, but an older child sees something going wrong in the lunch hall or in the playground or something, and they kind of intervene. And it turns out that the smaller child says, well, something bad has been happening to me for a while, but I mean, if I tell you about it, you mustn't tell anybody else. Yeah. And of course, that's absolutely fatal, because if the older kid agrees to that and then listens to what's happening as bad, then of course they have to tell an adult. Of course that adult has to deal with it, and that will involve telling other people. The thing that used to happen when I was young, before I had kind of a lot of responsibility, when I was a young teacher, my line on this was always, if you tell me about something, I'll make sure it will never happen again. Yeah. Now, that's quite hard if it's just you. I mean, you have to have the full weight of the world behind you. Because in my teaching career, I heard stories, I had to say, not at the school I was working in, but from prospective parents who were bringing their children in. You talked about one on your episode or two ago about a horrific case of the child being bullied in a school and then coming to you. And I mean, that happened quite often to me. And it was an interesting situation because you were almost at that point, I think, obliged to take the child in. So I think I always took in victims of bullying in other schools because I thought it was right, and I thought it was much less likely that they would get bullied at the school I was working in. But some terrible things were happening to young people. I remember a child who, I can't remember why, I can't actually remember why, but she had lost her hair. So a girl had lost her hair completely. She wore a wig. And in the school that she came from, the big thing was to try and grab her wig and chuck it about and put it down the toilet and stuff. Absolutely. I mean, it's horrific. It's unspeakable. I mean, it's unspeakable. Now, in that kind of instance, I have to say, I don't think I'd have been doing much about bringing people together. I would just have been bringing out my guillotine.
Yeah. Likewise.
Yeah.
I mean, that is bullying to me. When it is just spine-crawlingly awful. And you know that the acts that have been perpetrated against a particular child will probably live with that person, affect who they are for the rest of their lives.
So the whole concept of restores the justice, for example. I mean, one of the things that's happening in Scottish education at the moment is that it's falling into polar opposites. So you either believe in a situation where children can't talk in the corridors at school, or you believe in the kind of restorative justice. I mean, I have an example of which was given to me recently where one big boy had kind of kicked in a little boy. And the first thing, I believe this to be true, the first thing that the deputy head had said at the restorative conversation between them was, do you have any idea, Jamie, what you might have done that annoyed big boy so much? That's almost funny, but it's so ludicrous. Yeah, well, I am. I wouldn't have been laughing at the time, I tell you, but certainly not if I was Jamie. And that polarity between the I would flog it to within an inch of his life, bring back the birch, and I would sit him down, give him a hot chocolate and a chocolate biscuit, and let them talk to me, and be nice to them.
Yeah.
But the problem is, these aren't polars. These are actually things that can both happen. One of my friends, who's the deputy head of I might have said this before here, but a deputy head of a school in Edinburgh, he said, I like to give my kids 100% positive regard, but it doesn't mean I can't kick their arses. Yeah. And I think that's completely right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of looking after the children.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's funny, you talking about using prefix or a great story from school was a teacher who said, look, we blah-de-blah is having a tough time, and I think this older boy is maybe giving us, will you just keep an eye on the situation? And because he was a very trustworthy pupil, and I said, of course, I'll keep an eye on it. And if there's anything untoward happening, I'll come back to you. And member staff said, that's fabulous. Anyway, it's interesting the perception of kids, because he was a primary school child, and he came back to the teacher and he said, you ken how you've got me spying for you? Which is not quite what the teacher had anticipated. So, but yes, but I certainly find in my career that relying on other kids to bring stories that are not good, that are unhappy, it is really refreshing, because I think sometimes we're in danger of seeing all children under the age of 18 as somehow devils with horns, and they're not. And the number of times that bullying is actually ceased and desisted is actually as a result of other people's coming to management saying, look, this boy's having a hard time, you maybe haven't noticed it, and these boys are to blame.
Yeah. And that's very heartening.
That is really hard.
Because it suggests a kind of community kind of feeling about what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think that, I don't think that there is any doubt whatsoever that in a situation where a bully bullies a victim, that generally speaking, the bully has more going on that's very negative in their life than the victim does. So you have to balance the fact that the bully must understand that they must not ever do this again.
Yeah.
And I mean, in some situations where it's very, very severe, then the bully has to carry on their education somewhere else, I would say. They can't be in the presence of this victim. And again, you have to protect them.
Yeah.
Just as you would in civil society. I mean, just as an aside, one of the things that always amazed me about parents coming in and saying, and eventually this bully pushed her down the stairs and she broke her arm, was that they've so rarely involved the police. You know, that directly they involve the police. They trust the school, and yet very often in these circumstances, it's actually the school that kind of failed them.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the interesting issue that, just as a wee plug, I've got a column in the Scotsman on Tuesday. Whether anybody will hear this before Tuesday, I don't know, for this is Sunday, so probably not. But it will be on my blog shortly about additional support needs. And one of the things that's really interesting is that, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, but nonetheless, as you will know, Rod, it's now the case that 43% of children in Scotland have an additional support need, an official additional support need. Interestingly, two of these categories are children who have been bullied and bullies. And I think that's a really interesting thing that bullies are regarded as people with additional support needs in the same breath as bullying victims, since obviously their needs are very different indeed. How would you debrief a bully? He's been quite quiet now. He's looking to me as if I'd said that in a different language, and I'm just gonna try that one again. So, Rod, how would you debrief a bully?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Colin, if I think there is a bully in my midst, then I don't know that debriefing is really the way that I would go around it.
Are you once you punish them though?
Well, once I punish them, I would say, this is exactly what I would do, actually. I would say that you've served a suspension by the law for 3 days. When you return, you will appear at my office at 8:15 a.m. You'll knock on the door. I will invite you in and we'll have a discussion about your future at the school. And that debrief, if you like, would be making it very clear my expectations going forward, and also what would happen if those expectations were not met.
So, I mean, just to be clear, I kind of agree with this, really, because I think there are a lot of people in the school generally speaking, to deal with this. You wouldn't attempt a kind of pastoral line. So, because it's just that all the evidence seems to suggest that people who bully are themselves bullied. That very often, they once you start talking, in my experience, to the parents, and this didn't happen very often to me, but if you start talking to somebody who is the parent of a bully, you begin to wonder precisely what's happening at home in terms of the child themselves being bullied, and seeing thus bullying and violent and aggressive behaviour as being the way to get things done.
Yeah, and I see this in the children's home that we look after. You'll get children who are just unbelievably damaged through no fault of their own, but because of their upbringing, and because of the violence they've witnessed and the violence against them, or the abuse, whatever nature that may take. And it alters how they deal with society. It alters their relationships with other people, and those relationships are destructive. And so that situation, there's a lot, I suppose, that I would want to do in terms of mentoring, and just saying it doesn't have to be this way, and what are the likely outcomes of that continued behaviour. And so there's an understanding. However, there does come a point where you think, well, this person has had this awful upbringing, reacts to situations in a way that people who've not had that kind of upbringing would react in a kind or gentle way, and they are the polar opposite to that, and they pull a knife out on someone and stab them. We then don't say, well, that person shouldn't go to prison because look at the terrible background they've had.
Yeah.
So that's a balance that I'm so glad I'm not a judge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's not really for us in the context of this podcast to talk about things like the prison system and things like that, but I agree that an awful lot of what goes on and what's caused situations are due both to environmental things at home and also to failings on the part of the school system. And the school system needs to be a much wider thing to accommodate more people doing lots and lots of different things. In many, many ways, that would then reduce the prison population a bit. Finally, though, I wonder if there have been situations, because I have found these situations where there's a pretty clear-cut case of bullying going on. Some child has been badly got at by another individual or more than one individual. Have there been situations in which you talked to the victim about ways in which they can make themselves a less obvious victim?
No, I certainly had conversations on why do you think this has happened? What would you like me to do about it?
Yes.
It's actually quite a powerful question.
Yes.
Because very often they will recognise themselves that, well, perhaps this and perhaps that, and I don't want you to be actually overly hard, but I would stop.
Yes.
And I do what you did. I guarantee, by the way, this is going to stop.
Yes.
It's actually
99%.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And that's where that restorative justice bothers me slightly. Because in my experience, taking actually a firm line, pointing out the other ways, works.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a long time ago talking to a boy who I liked, but he had come from the south of England. He had never been in Scotland before. He was very, very, very much a south of England boy. And eventually I had to say to him, he thought he was being bullied. And his parents thought he was being bullied. And eventually I had to say to him, look, I think the reason that people are getting at you isn't because you're English. I think it's because you're annoying. And I was able to explain that in terms of his own dialogue with me, if that makes sense. That, and I was kind of wanted to say to him, to be absolutely honest, that there were moments even in this conversation where my instinct was to be unpleasant to you because I thought you were being unpleasant to me. And I think it was a kind of misunderstanding that was going on. I think he had brought with him a particular kind of manner which the people who were wanting to give him a slap and who had occasionally given him a slap thought was kind of superior, that he was arrogant.
Yeah.
And actually, he was arrogant.
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting thing because you so much want the idea, one so much wants the idea that the victim of bullying is kind of blameless and got at.
Yeah.
When in fact, there is an element sometimes where you have to kind of say to them, look, I think this may have happened to you for several reasons,
Okay, I've said
Is large that. I mean, I think that's a very sort thing.
Yeah, really difficult. I'm thinking of one pupil actually quite recently, but I don't want to go into too much detail, but they end up at 4 or 5 different schools, always blaming the school for not looking after their child, that they're being relentlessly bullied. And it's exactly as you pointed out, the child actually has idiosyncratic behaviours that are actually very annoying to that age group.
Yes, I agree. We are very difficult. I think it's important to say, listening public, that we are not suggesting that what you do every time in a bullying situation, you start with the victim and say, why do you think that happened? Because that brings you back to that ludicrous example we gave earlier on. What do you think it was that caused Jimmy to hit you? Whereas, in fact, what you're required to do is get rid of the bully's bullying tendencies with regard to that child and all the others as far as you possibly can.
And that's about culture, but it's also about society. What worries me is if you look at world leaders, without naming names because I want to trouble that country, you do despair.
Answers on a postcard, ladies and gentlemen. Which country is he thinking of?
Just the lack of kindness.
Who does he know in Venezuela?
And yet, celebrated. The leader of a country.
Wait, I think kind of slightly neatly. The American writer George Saunders gave a speech once at his old high school, and he talked about an instance where which he said he thought about every day, where he regretted the fact that a girl who was in his year group at high school, who looked very odd, behaved very oddly, spoke very oddly, was relentlessly bullied while he was there. And he said that he regretted that every day, and he thought about it every day. And then he paused and he said, and I think you're thinking that I was one of the bullies, but in fact, I wasn't. I at no stage interacted with her or interacted with the bullies or said anything to the bullies. And he said, but I do regret now that I was just a little bit kinder to her. Yeah. And his message was that, in essence, we should all just try to be a little bit kinder every day. And of course, if one could get that message across wholesale into schools about kindness and the need to be kind, and make that the great objective of schools to encourage people to be kind, then not only our schools, Rod, but the world would be a different place.
Indeed. This is exactly the ethos I tried to develop at Clifton Hall. And, I only have one expectation of you, above all, and that is that you're kind to each other.
Yeah.
And I would use the phrase, look, at this school, you're allowed to be who you are. And let's celebrate people's differences and the diversity of human nature and not look to pounce on it at every moment. And I wondered if it was first appointed back in 2005, whether or not you actually be able to create a culture, but you can. And by the time you got to 2015, 2016, I would actually say to parents, we don't have issues of bullying in the school. Because the culture was so embedded that it was those older pupils that would come and say, actually, there's been an unkindness here that looks as if it's going to develop into something greater. And so everybody bought in. Now, it doesn't mean that bad incidents didn't occur. But they were so few and far between by the end.
Yeah, it used to be a great trope back when I was in teacher training that if a head teacher said to an inspector, there's no bullying in this school, then they weren't a very good head teacher.
Yeah.
But actually, I agree with that. I think it is possible to build societies in which you put a stop to unpleasant behaviour before it becomes bullying.
Yeah.
So I think on that optimistic note,
Absolutely. We'll round off. Well, I hope once again you've enjoyed listening to this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. Looking at the world of schools, leadership, and especially today's discussion on bullying. If you've got thoughts, questions, or stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. And you can reach us, as we said earlier, on rodandcameron@gmail.com. And although this particular episode has dealt with a very difficult area, we would love to hear stories for the future episode of funny things that happened to you at school. Anyway, make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next. And if you've enjoyed today's chat, leaving a quick review really helps more listeners find us. And remember, in education and in life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening.
bye-bye.
Class dismissed.